Go ahead.
A big hello to all of you who have tuned into this webinar, which accompanies the release of the report, A New Investor Consensus, the Rising Demand for Healthy Buildings. We're very pleased you're taking the time out of your undoubtedly busy schedules to hear from the report's authors and to learn a little more on the increasing relevance of healthy buildings in today's built environment, and in particular in today's real estate investment portfolios. No doubt many of you have heard the word acceleration. That's been associated with many real estate investment strategies since the onset of COVID-19. From a pure investment standpoint, logistics, life science, digital real estate, these are examples of sectors which have found themselves accelerated in terms of their popularity for investors. Retail properties, hospitality properties, potentially they found an acceleration happening too, though possibly in a negative direction. But permeating all of the property sectors, however, has been another accelerating trend, that of social impact investing. And a big part of that, the S, the widely used ESG acronym, has been a keenness to improve health and well-being for tenants and wider communities. COVID-19 has shone an unwavering light on many social issues, including challenges relating to physical health, but also mental health, alongside other problems like injustice and inequity. While clearly not exclusive to real estate, these issues have nevertheless found themselves on the responsibility ledgers of the world's prominent landlords. I'm the senior editor for real estate at PEI Media, the group responsible for publications PERE and Real Estate Capital. And from our places in the industry's commentary box, we've seen a seismic response by the folks concerned with institutional level real estate investing. In short, when it comes to ESG, and now all parts of the acronym, what was once nice to have is now must have. We at PERE and Real Estate Capital think a Rubicon has indeed been crossed when it comes to institutional mindsets here, and we're clearly not alone. In support of that point, here's an astounding statistic for you. Registrations for Fitwel, the healthy building certification program run by the Centre of Active Design, increased by some 644% from Q4 in 2019 to the fourth quarter last year. As such, I'm delighted to have been invited by the good folks at the Centre to moderate this discussion on healthy buildings and to hear more about the salient findings from the report, which was co-authored by the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative and the private real estate manager BentallGreenOak. The format of today's session will comprise three parts. First, I'm going to introduce Joanna Frank, the President and CEO for the Centre of Active Design. Joanna will then walk us through the aforementioned salient findings of the report. And that mini presentation shall set a scene for a short discussion with our esteemed fellow panelists around what we've just heard. Our panel also comprises Amy Price, President of BentallGreenOak, Jill Brodsky, Chief Impact Officer at fellow private real estate manager Harrison Street, and Jeff Brodsky, Vice Chairman of the renowned developer Related Companies. We're going to then throw the session open for some Q&A time with all of you who are tuning in. And I'm going to assume most of you are already au fait with the intricacies of Zoom by now, so please do feel free to type your questions into the chat. We'll endeavour to answer as many as possible in the time allotted to us. So without further ado, please allow me to pass the conch over to you, Joanna.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Good morning, good afternoon, and really early good morning to Amy, who is on the West Coast. So I wanted to start by giving you a little understanding of the motivation behind us conducting the survey in the first place. And as Jonathan mentioned, this was done in partnership with the UN and BentallGreenOak. So I want to just acknowledge their role in this, really making it possible. So this survey that was conducted was a global survey to real estate investors and owners of property. It really represents diverse portfolios of assets as well as diversity in geography as well. To our knowledge, it's actually the largest survey on health and wellness in the real estate sector that's ever been conducted. And the respondents represent $5.75 trillion of assets under management, of which over $1 trillion are specifically real estate investments. So we were really interested to understand what was the attitude towards health and wellness before the COVID-19 pandemic in this sector, because we don't have a lot of data on that. And then, of course, how has COVID-19 really affected those attitudes throughout the pandemic? And then what is that looking like going forward? What do these investors see as the future? What is their plan for the future? So really interesting information that was brought up by the survey. Next slide, please. I want to start by just kind of doing a little level setting is what do we mean by a healthy building? Because this is still a new concept to most. Before the pandemic, folks were beginning to really prioritize healthy buildings within the real estate sector. We were already seeing kind of 80% growth year on year at Fitwel, but it really still represented the minority in the sector. So when we say healthy buildings, it's really three things that makes a building healthy. The first is that it's responding to the demands of the occupants of that building. There is no one size fits all when it comes to health. You really can do this in an incremental way. And 80% of the folks we work with, those are existing assets. So this is not about just new construction. You can absolutely prioritize this within existing buildings and existing assets. So really important that you respond to the demand, to the specifics of your actual building or portfolio. The next is that you use strategies that are based in the evidence base. There's 100 years of public health research to draw from. And in our databases alone at the Center for Active Design, we have 5,600 peer-reviewed research studies that we use to inform all of our work, as well as the Fitwel certification. So you use the strategies that are backed by the evidence base that we know have a measurable impact on health, and that knowledge is out there. So that knowledge is known and has already been translated for the real estate sector. And then thirdly, you are measuring the impact of your buildings on the occupants. Again, you are measuring tenant satisfaction, you are measuring tenant trust, because it's important that we understand the intersection between promoting the health of occupants and the financial returns for those assets, because that is how we will have long-term change around health and wellness in real estate. Next. So as we said, this report is available for you guys to download. This is also being recorded. You do not need to write down all these stats, but just know that 87% of those surveyed really were experiencing an increase in demand for health, and 92% of them anticipated that that was going to continue to grow over the next year after the kind of the intense phase of the pandemic has begun to wane. Next slide. Another very high number are looking to enhance their health and wellness going forward. So this is going to become a priority. And as Jonathan said, health and wellness has really tipped from being a nice to have, a market differentiator pre-pandemic, to an essential risk mitigator now that we are in a pandemic or post-pandemic, depending on where you are in the world. Next slide. And how are folks going to be doing that going forward? Well, going forward, good news for us, Fitwel, 66% of folks said that they were going to be using a healthy building certification, because that way you have validated data, you are using validated metrics. So 66% will be using healthy building certifications going forward. And next slide. The most, actually 74% represents the highest number, are going to be tracking key metrics going forward. And we're probably going to have a lot of discussion now about what those metrics are, where that state of play is when it comes to metrics around S. Next slide, please. And finally, kind of we wanted to understand the motivations of the sector, and the motivations were highly diverse. You see here the kind of the 4 highest ranking motivations, but they really were a diverse set of motivations, and we've listed them all in the survey. But interesting that tenant satisfaction is up there at 91%, because one of the other themes that we've seen developing over the COVID era is that tenants are driving this demand. They're driving it in all sectors. Investors are seeing that. We're seeing it at Fitwel. So this is a tenant-led demand primarily, which is different from pre-COVID, when the demand for healthy buildings was really being led by building owners. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Jonathan so we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joanna. All right, well, I'm gonna open up with a fairly general question, and any of you can jump on this. You've heard some of these key takeaways. Do any of these findings surprise you? If so, what and why? If not, why not? Jeff, I'm going to pick on you.
That's quite all right. You can do that throughout the hour, Jonathan. The question of surprise, no. This is something that's been evolving for a long time. I think healthy buildings started out 15, 20 years ago with the issues around sustainability, issues around measurement for light and air, and even LEED certification early on were one of the first ways that people would be comfortable with whether or not this was a reasonably healthy environment. I think the Center for Active Design has stepped it up to an additional level, which is a science-based approach to actually measuring the healthy impact of buildings, as opposed to a series of steps that people presumed would be helpful. It is also much more specific than what LEED might offer, and is focused explicitly on the health effects. And so I think there's no question it's a continuum. I think there's no question, as you said, the accelerant has been COVID. And no, there's no exaggeration as to the focus of who is pushing this forward. And frankly, it's not just the tenants, and it's not just the owners, and it's not just the investors. It's all of them. And we're seeing that in multiple conversations at multiple levels.
Amy, Jeff mentioned the accelerant has been COVID, and I want to just touch on the motivations aspect here. 91% said COVID-19, was a catalyst here. Did we really need a pandemic to be at this point?
Well, again, I think accelerant's the right word, right? I agree with what Jeff said. We've been on this trajectory. There's this evolution of defining an environmental or sustainable, building, kind of more looking at the building and then looking at, I'd say, the human element of it. So I think this journey we've been on, I think the accelerant is, nothing like a pandemic to focus on health and wellness. And I think particularly when the focus is on airborne transmission, viruses, and therefore kind of understanding when I think the statistic is that we spend 90% of our time indoors in our homes and our buildings. So, you have to feel safe and well when you go to work. I think the other definition of health is, instead of, it's the shift, I think, with COVID a little bit is, there's certainly I don't want to get sick, but I think, the evolution is, how do I actually support wellness? How does a building make me feel, safer, better, et cetera? And so that is where I think that's evolutionary, as opposed to the focus really specifically on virus containment. Those issues are more prevalent because of the pandemic.
Okay, Jaron, I'm going to bring you back in. That illustration was fascinating. It showed all the sort of possible constituent parts of a healthy building. Is that really what should we take away from that? Is the epitome of a healthy building? And if you were to lose a number of those components, does that make a building not healthy? What's the best way to look at those? Is it a tick list? Should people try to achieve all of those types of elements?
No, it's not a tick list. So health is different from other aspects of, you're kind of looking at your amenities or the attributes in a building, in that anything you do to improve health, any of the kind of evidence-based strategies, have an incremental impact on health. So it's much more circular. But as humans, we experience everything. And when we're talking about health, we're talking about your mental health, as well as physical health, as well as social health as well. So that extends into the community at large, and buildings obviously shape our neighborhoods. So they have a massive impact on community. Equity is also an integral part of health. It isn't other than health, it is part of health. So it's really very broad. And as I said, what you're really looking to do is to optimize the actual building that you have, the actual asset that you have. So it isn't like a bar that only if you have these characteristics would you be considered healthy. That is not how health works. In Fitwell, the strategies are weighted. They have different number of points, and that's totally dependent on the strength of the body of evidence and the measurable impact on health. So it's really relative to each other. So this strategy is relatively more impactful on health than another strategy. That doesn't mean the other strategy doesn't impact health. So it's really like, how do you optimize an environment for both the people that are in the building, because they all have different health needs as well. Jill's portfolio serves a really different group of people, occupants, than BentallGreenOak's portfolio, just for example, and therefore your response needs to be different. Geographies make a difference. So you really have to be site specific. You have to be people specific, because this is about people, right? This is not about the building, actually. It's about what impact that building has on the people in that building. So it's really the other way around from the way that we're used to looking at stuff as building people. This is about people as opposed to buildings. So I would love to kind of hand that over to Jill to talk about kind of like, they have such unique kind of portfolio where they're really looking at a different population than other folks.
Good thought. Jill, why don't you talk us through the portfolio then with your organization and give us an idea of the sort of the social impact it has on its wider community.
Absolutely. Well, I will talk about two of the sectors that we invest in, the senior living side and student housing. And as Joanna was just referencing, I mean, this is obviously very different. It's very community-based. It's not like a traditional office or even a traditional multifamily where folks aren't connecting with one another and engaging with one another. They're living, working, they're all together on the student side and certainly on the senior side. They are one larger community. So that's really important. Going back to maybe an earlier point that you mentioned, Jonathan, about how much has COVID-19 accelerated what we've been doing. It has and it hasn't. I mean, when you look at those sectors, both on the physical side and certainly the mental health side, loneliness, for example, the two generations that suffer the most from this are senior and student. So capturing a lot of the mental piece that Joanna was referencing is keenly important for these sectors. So we've been really involved in all of the health and wellness from the get-go because it's very important to those two generations, I guess I'll say. And so everything that we're talking about with, like Joanna said, with the people, it starts with the people. So in terms of COVID, what are the issues that we had there? On the senior side, we had people that were sequestered. They were isolated. It was the loneliness factor, not so much the health piece, the physical piece, it was the mental piece that was concerned. Similarly with the students, they were taken out of their communities and they had to go back home or those types of things. So those things going forward are going to be incredibly important. And I'll stop there because I know we want to talk about the data piece a little bit later.
Oh, of course. Actually, well, it's very interesting you mentioned the mental piece there. Of course, I can understand how that would be front and center for things like student and senior living. Of course, Amy and Jeff, you guys have got assets under management in many other sectors. How do you tackle the mental piece with those sectors, offices, logistics, assets like this? What is the good work to be done in this area?
Amy, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me, I think when you talk about mental, I mean, a lot of it goes right now to what is the state of mind of someone coming into this building? Do they feel safe? Do they feel protected? And so it's a lot about communication and engagement. And I think the point was made earlier, it's not about the building per se, it's about creating an environment within that building that is, uniquely kind of suited to those tenants. So whether that means, just pretty basic things these days, like hand sanitizer stations, PPE, it's giving tenants a sense of, okay, I feel safer, if you will, in this building. Industrial, interestingly, we've had more focus on, you don't think of industrial as being a very high touch in terms of just the number, the human engagement, right? You think much more about this in office and in residential and probably third retail. But we've actually been working with some of our larger tenants in our industrial properties to provide, a little bit more support around just turnover times, food, cleanliness, of just how to help people feel, giving drivers and other logistics kind of people more space in their properties to kind of feel, if you will, mentally, kind of healthier, if you will. Jeff.
Sure. Jonathan, it's we work in a number of different asset classes, as Amy was discussing, and I'll frame this as the giving people comfort to return to their home or their office. We we provide a space for people, right? Regardless of whether it's retail or office or hotels or residences. And so we need to have them feel comfortable in their space. Sometimes they're home, but as you said, sometimes we spend more time in our offices than our homes. So a lot of that was about communication and giving people more information and in concise ways, and in some ways humanistic, and even in some cases with a bit of I guess of an uplifting message, right? So an awful lot of COVID was extremely technical and appropriate to the risks to folks, but we were basically saying you can be safe here, and we're going to give you comfort with that. So the communication was broad-based, consistent, and importantly, we also felt that we, specifically in New York, I guess because of the epicenter nature of it, because of the concentration of offices that we have here, we felt there was a need to bring in another party to give you even more comfort. So it's easy to say we're following all the government practices. There were enough questions in the media about which government practices, the state, the CDC, the city, everybody had their own practices. So we established another purely medical oversight with a branded hospital system that reviewed every document and every sign and every protocol, and allowed us to use their name in our communications to give people comfort. And so that was another voice of independent thought around, you'll be okay. And we returned, for example, even to our own employees, we returned to our offices literally 11 months ago, as soon as the governor said we could in New York. And we may be one of the only people in the building still. That is changing every day. But we need to give our folks comfort too. So it's, your direct employees in addition to your clients.
Gee, that's just provoked a question in my mind. Do you guys as real estate managers feel an obligation to be the first to put your feet back in the water in that sense, lead by example?
Yeah, there's no question about it. Our CEO has been very forthright about this, has been public about this. And I'll speak to all of our offices around the country. We have main offices in New York and in Chicago, Boston, and LA, and San Francisco, and DC. So the issue here was, first of all, we have an awful lot of folks who are essential workers who are taking care of people in all these buildings. We own a large portfolio of apartment buildings and all the rest of the asset classes, and our building workers have been there the whole time. And why would we not return to our office if they are out there working with our residents and in our office buildings with our tenants? And so that was number one. Number two, we definitely believe that in the urban centers, office occupants need to return to generate the economic activity to bring people back to the cities. And it's a bit of a knitted fabric. Everyone needs to do it all at the same time, and everybody's waiting for everybody else. So it's nice to hear that Broadway is coming back. It's nice to hear that the trains are running on time. But there are an awful lot of small businesses that are waiting for large-scale central business district occupants to come back, and they're excited about doing so. So yeah, we definitely wanted to be here first and show that it was doable and safe and comfortable, and show that the rest of the occupants that they could return as well.
Amy, we're talking about leading by example here. I mentioned there's been an evolved understanding around the S part of the ESG equation. Anyone viewing our own coverage of your organization has seen that you've taken some pretty hard measures at your own company. So you put a step forward first there. Areas of social injustice and equity, for instance, were at the heart of that. But I got to ask you, how do you translate that, or how do you transport that approach to the management of your assets too, and to the influencing of those folks who would occupy them?
Yeah, well, good question. So I guess what I'd say is, if you think of the banner of ESG, there's a lot that, in my mind, and in our minds, is part of the S, your social impact, right? And I guess the way we think about it, there are pillars of communities that we impact: our communities, our tenants, our supply chain, our employees. generally, right? And so we do think about all that connectivity. So our focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion, as an organization very much goes to that employee pillar of social, right? What are we doing as an organization within our own team to, be more diverse and more inclusive, and to frankly better represent the communities that we invest in, the tenants, the residents, and our investors. So, but I think if I'm answering your question, within S, it's important to not just look at your employees. You have to look at your communities. You have to look at your tenants. And again, this goes very much to me, this discussion around healthy buildings is very much around tenants and more broadly communities. And so I think, it's all connected in this construct of how do we as owners of real estate, how are we impacting all these different constituents in a way that's constructive, that, is creating, a more positive impact on our communities. And again, diversity and inclusion is one of the ways we measure that. So we are looking more closely at our service relationships, as an example, right? How do we manage buildings? Some places of the world we do it ourselves, some we use third parties. But how are we making those decisions, and how are we ensuring that the focus on equity, diversity, inclusion is infusing those different elements of how we are impacting our communities more broadly?
And Jill, this is your backyard entirely. I mean, do you have sort of further comments to make in this area?
Specifically around diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're saying?
And the role the manager can play with its assets, with influencing what goes on within its assets, who occupies them, how you work with them, except those folks, etc.
Yeah, so in our particular business, we don't operate the actual assets. We work with a third party that does the operations, but we work incredibly closely with the companies that are doing this. So in terms of the influence, there's a wide variety of things. We try to influence them around ESG principles and making sure they're thinking along those ways. So it's everything from, the traditional E, making sure that the way that the buildings are designed and the way that they're operated. But obviously the S, like what we're talking about with the social piece, we look at their DEI goals and what they're trying to do. We also, the other thing I would say we do a lot of influence around is around the technology. So for example, on the senior side, we're getting to a point, and thankfully people are living longer, but the problem is we don't have enough caregivers. So how do we make the building smarter, healthier, et cetera, so that the folks that are working inside or living inside these buildings are actually healthier, don't get sick as often, sleep better at night, all those types of things. So those things are critically important. So we do a lot of vetting of technology and then introduce things to them. One technology that we've used and we've invested in is an AI technology that actually measures one's cognitive health. And this is both on the senior side and the student side. And on the senior side, it can tell you, it can predict if someone's on the path for Alzheimer's or dementia, or maybe apt to fall or to lose their independence. And then this gives the caregivers better information on how we can take better care of that individual because we're pre-armed. On the student side, it can help detect if someone is that it might be clinically depressed, if they're having an episode, if they're suffering from stress or anxiety or suicidal thoughts, and almost be able to triage those situations. So this is maybe kind of an extension, or maybe the normal the normal definition may not include some of this in the social piece, but I think if we're able to introduce technology to take better care and offer just really better services to the communities that we're serving, that is incredibly impactful.
I mean, that sounds amazing, Jill. The idea that you can mitigate potential shortfalls in numbers of carers by improving the abilities of a building is quite phenomenal. That's very interesting to hear for sure.
And I'll give you one more example. There's a company that makes floor tiles, and when an individual stands on them, it can detect their vitals. So their heart rate or their blood pressure or various things. So if Mrs. Smith weighs 100 pounds when she goes to bed at night, she wakes up and steps on the floor tiles and all of a sudden she's 105, something has happened. When would a nurse or a caregiver notice that? But if the building can actually alert that person, that can save potentially the person's life or some other thing. So these are the types of things that I think making the building smarter, bringing in some of these extra elements of S or whatever we want to call it, really can enhance the care and just the services that we're providing our tenants and residents.
Fair enough. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. This obviously a lot of this these things that we're talking about sound optimal, but they also, some of them sound expensive, and you know, there will be many people tuning into this session wondering, you know, what is their best route to a healthy building portfolio. Many will have substantial existing holdings and found some of those holdings accelerated, again, for want of a better term, towards a suboptimal or even obsolete condition. And they're going to be wondering what to do with these holdings. Substantial remedial CapEx is almost certainly going to play a part. Just how big a bill is this industry facing? Jeff, I'm going to pick on you again.
That's quite all right. You know, Jonathan, obsolescence has been with us forever. It's part of the assessment of the asset value and its risk profile associated with the hold period, right? So there's nothing new about that. It could have been a technology obsolescence because you didn't have enough broadband capability, or your elevator's too slow, or your lobby is out of style. It could be the ceiling heights and the view corridor. It could be the lack of access to public transit. It could be a million different things. Real estate is, by its nature, a relatively long-term asset hold, and it is also a obviously fixed in space. And so there are limits in every respect to the way the building presents to its potential occupants, which is literally the nature of where it comes to a value. And so, you know, healthy buildings are just adding to this story. It's another facet of a capital needs assessment that people will now consider, along with sustainability and energy efficiency and elevator speeds and touchless access. And so all of these things are part of the natural evolution of asset values. They are opportunities for smart owners and investors to differentiate their products against risks in the future. They are investments. And every one of the buildings will have a different profile as to which of those kinds of things that I just mentioned will come first and second and third. But this is now on the list. And
let me just challenge that point about, you know, obsolescence always being with us, of course. But we've also mentioned the word acceleration a number of times already in this session. I'm fairly confident, you know, 90-something% of the existing real estate around the world was underwritten on a pre-COVID basis. There's a lot of business plans changing. Tell you what, Amy, I'll pick on you next then. You know, I've been hammering at Jeff, but I'll pick on you. You know, presumably the CapEx component going forward has got to be, you know, significantly different in order for us to achieve the number of these aims that we've been discussing.
Yeah, and again, I'll actually broaden it out. I think we're talking about elements right now of healthy buildings, but if you put it in the broader ESG context, you know, there's another conversation going on around net neutral, carbon emissions, et cetera. Again, right? I mean, if you let's just take these two combined, right? If you sit here today in 2021 and you say by 2050 or by 2040, you know, we have to operate our real estate fundamentally differently. You know, on the one hand, I'd say the greenest buildings are the buildings that are already built, because those carbon emissions have already kind of, right, they're gone. It's a sunk cost. So we have to figure out how to continue to modernize and make more efficient the buildings are already built. You're right. And again, if you just put it in the broad scheme of how do you have a sustainable, you know, broadly defined building. So that's number one. Number two, I don't think the industry is starting to, I don't really think there's much emphasis on, you know, investment in value yet. And again, even if you think about, because you hear all these commitments to 2040, 2050, but even as an owner of real estate today, it is unlikely that we will continue to own the same assets in our portfolio in another 20 or 30 years than we own today. So we aren't looking necessarily through the lens of these are the assets that we individually or as a firm, right, are going to manage and own for our clients, but they're going to be owned by someone. So at some point, this is going to start coming. And I think the longer investment period you have, the more you have to start factoring it in now. I'd say the easiest place to start factoring in is what you don't buy and what you buy. It's the next decision that you make, right? So, we are definitely, we now have ESG criteria metrics that, again, are more comprehensive than just a healthy building. But I'd say looking at many different criteria, many different dimensions, trying to understand at least, maybe not down to the penny, not even down to the dollar, but to say, is this a capital intensive building, capital light, where is it on the spectrum? So I think you've got to start incorporating that in your decisions that you're going to make going forward. And if you got to start looking at your portfolio, and the easiest place, in my opinion, to start is assets that are not, modernized, that are going to be more capital intensive. There's still a market for those. You should sell those assets now and reinvest into assets that, are better suited.
I'd love to weigh in here and just come with the data here that there's a price to not doing this, right? So yes, there's a cost to making some of these improvements. A lot of this stuff is not rocket science though, right? We're talking about maintenance of green space. We're talking about air quality, which you probably already have the capacity for within your existing mechanical systems. But the cost to not doing it is the thing that I think has shifted over the COVID. So that's where the nice to have has happened, in that before COVID, actually MIT came out with a study that showed that there would be up to a 7% increase in asset value per rent through rent values for buildings that had a healthy building certification. So that was based on pre-COVID data, that there was already a significant differential in the amount of rent that those buildings could command. In talking to many of the folks who participated in the survey, that has now gone to, that's the amount that you would lose if you don't have healthy building strategies, if you aren't able to talk about how you're promoting the health and the safety of the occupants in your building. So it's no longer something that's seen as a plus, and that was always hard to kind of rationalize anyway, having looked at sustainability. But now folks are seeing that actually those assets will command lower rents. You will be less equipped to compete with similar assets within your market if you aren't able to say how you're promoting health and wellness and safety for your occupants. So it's gone to a risk. It's become a risk now. I mean, in many of the conversations we had with the investors we surveyed, one said you can't unsee the last year when it comes to risk, which I think is, yes, absolutely. It may have actually been Jeff that said that. So yeah, you can't unsee the last year as far as the risk that public health has on real estate, right? So we've all just had quite the lesson in that, obviously. So I think that stranded assets were talked about a lot by various investors that we spoke to, who said that, if we choose not to invest in an asset, you're probably not going to be able to keep or attract those Class A tenants that you're looking for. You will be able to rent it, but again, you're going to be renting it lower than you were anticipating potentially. And then at some point, the assets could get stranded if you actually start to be so out of sync with the demand coming from tenants. So I think all of these things are part of the plus and minus of doing this. So that's a big shift. Before, health was nice to have for sure.
That's fascinating. So potentially even a 14% differential then from those who have done the good work to those who have neglected to do that. A lot of the guys on this call will hang on numbers. They'll look at things like that and start to consider it in underwriting. Jeff, when you hear things like that, what's front of mind for you?
Well, look, it's very clear to us. We lead with healthy building commitments and what we're doing in our buildings when we talk about our buildings to investors. And we believe that that's up front for a lot, in front of mind, it's top of mind, and it's a value proposition. I don't believe you can have a claim to be a Class A asset in any asset class that doesn't have a strategy around healthy buildings. So it's clearly necessary. It's, by the way, it's not necessarily sufficient, but it's certainly necessary. And so it is clearly a differentiator. We fully believe that it is value significant. And frankly, I struggle with this issue of cost. Every building has a different profile, especially around what seems to be very sensitive to folks, which are air changes. And there's a certain amount of conversation around, well, the more air changes, especially in high heating and air conditioning load areas, could be actually counter to energy efficiency. But the fact of the matter is, that's part of our premise, is increased air changes is appropriate to make sure that we're creating a healthy air environment. And so every building will have a different density of occupancy, will have a different use profile, will have a different mechanical system, will have a different analysis. But it was not overwhelming for us to make the changes that were necessary in filtration or an air change. Everyone's, again, Class A buildings have sophisticated mechanical systems, EMS systems, engineering teams. You can do the right thing when it comes to air filtration and air change. And to a certain extent, a lot of our feedback from our occupants around what has been the last year's focus on cleanliness of touching surfaces or touchless access or seamless access, et cetera, is really still focusing on proximity and air change and masking these days. So that'll evolve also. But I think certainly all the issues around the certifications and things like Fitwel will go together. And over time, there's no question, I think the metrics are going to be the benchmarking, some form of scoring is going to go will be the standard, rather than just, I did the right thing with a MERV filter and I did the right thing with air changes.
Gotcha. Let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about reporting and data before I throw it open to the floor for questions, so we can hear what some of our audience are thinking. Joanna, the report suggests that effective reporting health and wellness and ESG strategies is still not totally widespread. You've got 53% report incorporating these factors, 42% incorporating it somewhat or very little. What are the impediments here? What are the respondents to the survey saying to you about what's stopping them from doing this, and how can this be addressed? And Jill, please feel free to chime in here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what happened with the S in ESG is that it's the one that's least understood by the real estate sector. And that's a really important distinction, because public health and other science know a lot about this. It's just that it hadn't really been translated and widespread adoption by the real estate sector. So it isn't that we don't know what S is, and it isn't that we can't measure it. It's that we in the real estate industry don't have this knowledge. And so obviously it took, 20 years on the E side to coalesce around carbon and other metrics. And health is in a more nascent phase, that there are a lot of ways to measure health impacts. There's a lot of ways to correlate those health impacts with business impacts, which we talked about earlier, tenant satisfaction, tenant trust, and so on. And there are also ways to correlate it with things like tenant stability, resident stability, employee retention, et cetera. So, but this work is very much in progress. And so we haven't, as an industry, coalesced around, these are the metrics that we are all going to agree on that denote the S in ESG. And it isn't for lack of metrics, it's for lack of us all coalescing around a few proxy measures, actually, because you won't use health measures, but you're going to use something like stability or something like that doesn't look directly at health, because you run into all sorts of issues around health when we're in real estate, right? We're not actually in the health business. And you want something that both is resonant on the financial side and is also directly correlated by the health impacts of occupants. So it's more of a coalescing that needs to happen, and that is happening fast, right? These discussions are happening all over the place, and this is coalescing quickly, but it isn't there yet. Absolutely isn't there yet. And I'd love Jill to kind of talk about what they're doing to kind of drive this conversation.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit more about what we're doing on the data side. And she's right. I mean, on the S side, there are ways certainly to measure it, but there is still an area there that's more qualitative. So how do we really change that into something that you can measure? So what we've done in Harrison Street is we have really committed that every building that we have people that are occupying those buildings. And I say that because we do invest in self-storage, and hopefully no one is living in those buildings, but all the buildings, well over 500, probably close to 600 buildings, we're going forward with a Fitwel certification. We're doing this for three reasons. One, which we've talked about before, market differentiation. And also, after COVID, Jeffrey mentioned about this, where we want to be able to say that we have this certification so people can feel safer. But really it's for market differentiation, to attract staff, to attract tenants, to attract residents. The second reason that we're doing it is we want to make sure that everything that is within the Harrison Street portfolio, that it meets a particular threshold for health and wellness, and something that is out there that's not a Harrison Street created threshold, but something that has been, proven out, tested, vetted, all of that, not only with the CFAD organization, but also with the CDC in this case. Third reason we're doing this is for the data. When we get all of these buildings on the senior side and the student side, and medical office and other sides, and we kind of see how they score, and we truly understand what they're doing from a health and wellness perspective, how do we correlate that to performance? That's what we want to look at. We really truly believe that buildings that are designed and operated really well as it pertains to ESG, that they perform better. We want to be able to demonstrate that. So there's many ways we can look at in terms of leading indicators. We can look at how much is someone influenced by the fact that there is, that it's promoted as a healthy building. What does that mean for someone signing a lease or deciding to work there or deciding to live there? How much does that influence them? We can look at, number of sick days. Does it go down because they're in this building versus one that is, either gets a lower score or isn't considered healthy for whatever reason? We can look at things that Joanna has mentioned before. Do they sleep better at night? Are the workers more productive? Those types of things. And then the other metrics, which are more attuned to real estate. How does it help with retention of tenants? Can we charge more for this? Is it easier and faster to attract people to our location? When it comes time to sell, are we getting more for that particular building? So she's exactly right. We're in the early innings, but the issue is we don't have enough data out there yet to be able to collect this and start to make these correlations. And that's why we're making this commitment now, because we truly believe there's going to be a connection. And once we figure out what those connections are, then we can replicate that across our other buildings.
I think it's, do you think it would be a litmus test of the success of this data gathering exercise? I gather we're in a sort of an early word territory here. So do you think the litmus test here would be, when we start to see groups pin their colors to a mast, give a year for hitting targets like they do on the E side of ESG? Now there seems to be a race to net neutral carbon emissions, right? And everybody is pitching a number. It's getting competitive. I don't get that sense on the S side of things yet, but do you think that's a fair litmus test? You start seeing that widespread and actually you're out of first word territory and you're into kind of final word.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think, most definitely it would be.
Okay.
One quick comment, Jonathan, is I feel like you listen to this conversation, it's exactly the conversation we were having, 10, 15 years ago around the E, right? It's just, will people believe it? How do we prove out the value proposition? Does it drive tenant satisfaction? Does it drive tenant retention? The same conversation we've had. And I say that because I would hope that as an industry, we've learned something from that so that there's just more intuition, there's more genuine belief, and that, yes, we need data and yes, we need to prove it out. But hopefully, I think this idea of having a certification as a standard, we're in the same place we were with, LEED buildings, whenever again, a decade ago. So I just hope we're quicker this time to figure this stuff out because we've done this once before. It's like the same conversation.
I completely agree with you. And I would think that it would be faster. And one reason too, I know when LEED first came out, there was some questions or concerns around, how performance-based some of the metrics were, and people were kind of questioning that. I think we collectively as an industry learned from that, and with whether it's Joanna's standard or other standards that are out there, they are performance-based, and that I think helps tremendously.
Yeah, well, and of course, if you are to make comparisons between now and then, let's assume that most technologies are much better advanced. And so the possibility of, let's use that word again, acceleration, is more profound. On just one final question on that, then, when it comes to data tracking, if you look at the report, you'll see a number of areas that one can track data. There is seemingly a kind of a hierarchy in what, in terms of the preferred areas. which are quite interesting, you know, to note, things including, you know, tenant satisfaction surveys, energy preparedness, indoor quality testing. These things ranked highest. But I don't want to put words into your mouth, Amy, Jeff, and Jill. I'd like to hear from you guys. You know, which parts of the data set does one prioritize to really move the story along, you know, for a given building?
I would say you have to really look at who's in the building. Going back to Joanna's earlier comments, it's about the people that are there. So in our case, student, it might be something that's more tied to mental well-being, which could tie into tenant satisfaction, but it might be very specific to that. With seniors, it might be more about their care. I mean, again, not to say they're not interested in indoor air quality, but that may not resonate as much as some of the other things in terms of the care aspect. So my comment would be, it really has to be focused on who are the people that you're serving.
Sure. Any further comments on that, Jeff or Amy?
You know, it's a tough question, Jonathan. I would say, to Jill's point, we have so many different asset classes and occupancy perspectives. Even when we talk about health, over the last year, we have a large affordable housing portfolio and with many seniors, and the most important health impact for them was vaccination access, and they were not going to leave their homes, and they didn't have, in many cases, digital facility, right? So the digital divide, especially in communities of color and concentrated poverty, are a huge social concern, which impact health. And so just focusing on health, we ended up participating with the CDC program on long-term care facilities that allowed us to arrange for vaccination of 10,000 seniors in their homes. The point being is that's an extraordinary circumstance, but every one of these occupancies has a different priority. And overwhelmingly, that was their priority. And so if we were able to engage enough to understand what their needs were, and to then bring those services to them, whatever that means for health, and in our case, it will extend to trying to bridge the digital divide for many of these families. That will allow for telehealth delivery and a whole series of other health benefits. That could be very different than what a market rate environment or student housing would look like. So I apologize, it's got so many different facets to it, but it's a great question.
Right, I'm going to call time on our panel. I'm noticing 8 minutes left. I owe the audience a big apology for that. We've gone over time. I guess we're having too much fun chatting away ourselves. Let me go into some of these questions, and this is unrehearsed in any way. So let's see what we've got here. Yeah, it's a very interesting one here from a chap called Ben Hext. CO2 is the language of green sustainable buildings. It is relatively straightforward to compare GHG emissions and tie this into ESG reporting. But how do you compare healthy buildings? Do you see a single standardized metric or score that will become a recognized standard that can be tied into ESG reporting, comparable to ton CO2? Where do you take that? Who wants to have a stab at that one?
I'd love to jump in. I think that it's going to be a proxy for, like, when you have healthier occupants, more satisfied occupants whose mental health is thriving, what is the outcome of that for the property? And that's where you get into the stability. So if you have resident stability, that is great for not just the resident themselves, and it's not just a measure of health, it's also going to impact educational success. It's going to impact opportunities, social bonds within a community. When you've been in a community for a long time, you build up a lot of social capital as well. So on the resident side, stability. On the tenant side, stability, because real estate developers, real estate owners want stable tenants, right? You want folks, sticky tenants that are re-signing leases, and they're only going to do that if you're serving their needs, and their needs are the needs of the individuals that they employ. And we see massive demand for health promotion within the employee base. So they're looking at the stability of their own workforce. So I think, and this is a think, this is not a no, but I think we're going to coalesce around some stability numbers because they correlate on both sides, financial as well as they are a proxy for health as well.
Thank you. Now, a number of the other questions we have touched on in part. There is one here, though, which I think is worth Amy and Jeff answering, if you may. Return on investment is not easy. In Bill Gates's book on climate change, he calls them green premiums. How do you convince clients that it's worth it?
Do you want to go first, Jeff?
Oh, sure.
Sure.
That's interesting. Our clients are, because we're very long-term investors, are our internal partners and our investor partners, right? And so in that frame of reference, there's so much that gets tied into this. I'm going to go back to, you do it because you believe you lead, right? You have early adopters who lead and say, this is how you differentiate. This is how you will always be considered a Class A asset. This is where Class A assets have attracted flight to quality capital from around the world, right? So whether it's geographic or asset class based, there has been no doubt in our minds that our investors expect a leading approach to ownership and investment perspective on our assets, and healthy buildings will be a part of that, just like the ESG facets will be part of it, and just like it's evolving into things like minority business spend on our supply chain is becoming part of it, and what our talent approach to diversity is as well. But there's no question that we consider it to be part of what's expected of a tier 1 organization, and the tier 1 organization is based on the returns that they deliver over time, with an aggregative perspective, this now being one of those very important facets. I don't think it stands exclusively alone, as you can draw a conclusion and say this is equal to this return on investment. I do believe that we are all going to be judged as either responsible and equitable owners with great returns, as differentiated from our peers, or not. And this is going to be part of that.
I gather that Joanne needs to leave us now. So thanks for joining us on that. We'll be wrapping up shortly with the last couple of questions, but thank you, Joanne.
Thank you.
Okay, well, there's another very interesting one here. And first of all, I've got to ask you, do we have anybody on the panel today that includes affordable housing within their portfolios? Because there is a question here on affordable housing.
Yes, we absolutely do have an affordable housing.
Right. What can asset managers focused on affordable housing, which are predominantly C buildings, do to improve the wellness of these?
Well, first, I would judge that whoever's assessing them as predominantly C buildings may have to look at more buildings, but they are not. They're certainly affordable to the folks who live there, and we are proud to own them and have been owners of affordable housing and developers for nearly 50 years now. So the health of the residents in those environments, interestingly, many are built with wellness standards that are part of the state or local approval process. And so you might have things like enterprise green communities, you might have LEED certification programs, all of which lead to better standards of health than what might be considered public housing, as an example. So for example, you might hear a lot about lead in pipes or lead paint issues. You'll find much less of that in the private sector owned real estate portfolio of affordable housing than you will in some facets of older public housing. And so
Gotcha.
there are a lot of facets to the health and wellness issues. Most of the approval processes incorporate playgrounds. Most of them are prioritized for transportation-oriented locations. And so there's an awful lot of affordable housing that's very, very healthy. So just to frame it a little differently.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to finish with one final question and then we'll wrap up. We have a question from actually from a chap from Brookfield in Brazil. Now, he's talking about the different programs out there, Fitwell and Well H&S that the folks are adopting when, for operational existing assets. This question, though, is very interesting. Do you believe tenants know the difference between these certifications? And there are potential, suggesting there are cost differences. So in your opinion, how does one go about, making the distinction and making it and deciding what's the priority?
Well, we've actually been working with both. I think you referenced Well and Fitwell. We've been working with both of those. Specifically to his question, I don't really think the tenant knows very much about the difference. I think it's not as common as LEED or BREEAM or some of these other certifications. So I think the onus is on us when we do this, not to just get the certification and check the box, but truly market it and talk about the fact what it is that we've done, why we've done it, why it's important. And I do see both of those standards as complementary, not necessarily competitive. And so I think you do whatever is best for that particular building, but you have to educate the audience that you're serving as to why you've done it. And then you will get the power of basically return on that of investment comes back because you've gotten the power of promoting the fact that you've done this.
Okay, thanks, Jill. Any final comments, Amy or Jeff?
Amy, go ahead.
Well, no, to that last point, I was just going to say quickly that I think there's two camps, and what you're seeing is either, again, tenants don't know the difference, and as Jill was saying, or they're really sophisticated, and it's not about a certification, it's about understanding the actual, they will get into the building operations. I mean, they will get into it with you. And those are the large tech users, et cetera, who are far more sophisticated. So again, you've kind of got the bellwethers, right? And there's not as much in the middle. But no, I mean, I think this is, I love that we're having this conversation. I do feel that it's always nice to look at silver linings, and a silver lining of the past year is that there's just going to be, I think, accelerating's the word that gets used, but there's just greater focus on generally, evolution in the real estate business in all these dimensions that are so impactful to the communities that, we're investing into and the buildings that we own and manage. So happy to be a part of it.
Well, thanks, Amy. I think, to be honest, we'd struggle to find finer concluding words than that. So we'll call it time. And I just leave me to thank Joanna and the team at the Center for Active Design for producing an illuminating report, which I suggest you all do have a good look at if you haven't already. Unquestionably, it helps move along in the ESG agenda, for the real estate industry. And then thank you to our esteemed panel, Amy, Jeff, and Jill, for joining us. We appreciate you joining the discussion. It's been really enjoyable to be part of this, and thank you for myself as well. It's nice to have the invitation to be part of this. So, and then finally, thank you to all of you who've taken the time to tune in. Your attendance is hugely appreciated. Your questions are welcome, and it just leaves me to say goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Thank you, ladies.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone.
All the best.